Everyone, as Constantine seized upon that drift away from New Testament Christianity and formed that drifting group into a church that he called a state church called Christian, with himself as the chief leader or the boss over that, and that grew into what became the Roman Catholic Church by about 600, a new entity popped on the scene. Very unexpected, but very powerful. And that new entity, that new player on the European, especially the eastern end of Europe stage, was Islam. Muhammad was born, and he was the founder of this new religion called Islam. So I'm going to talk about that in these next few moments and how it impacted this state church, this Roman church, which then had become called the Roman Catholic Church. The exact date of Muhammad's birth is not known, but it is known that he died on June the 7th in 632. He was about 65, somewhere in the neighborhood of 65. He was born in or close to Mecca. You know, he was a trader. He was in one of those camel caravans and a sort of nomad type fella. And so it's not exactly sure where he was born, but it was close to Mecca. And he lived in that kind of environment of violence and tragedy. Really, his whole life was a tragedy. He traveled with his uncle. His dad died very young, and he traveled with an uncle who then died, and he just traveled around. And as he went certainly down into Syria and down in probably as far as Egypt, he became exposed to Judaism. When he was in Israel, he learned about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and became quite familiar with them. He also became pretty familiar with Christianity, but himself by birth and by his heritage was an Arabic man, and he was very familiar with the Arabic religion, which primarily centered around the worship of the moon. If you know much about Islam, you've seen their symbol, and it is the crescent moon. And that is indicative of the basic pagan religion of the Arabs in the time of Muhammad. Muhammad believed that God had raised him up to start a new religion. And so he began to talk about it and write about it. Muhammad was an epileptic. He had seizures, frequent seizures. And ironically, and it's surprising that he could convince people that when he had these seizures, it was because God had come upon him and was giving him revelation. So in the process of these epileptic seizures, he said Gabriel particularly was telling him information, and he was getting what is now their central book. It's the Cauldron. It's spelled a couple of different ways, Cauldron and Quran, but it's the book that guides the Islamic religion. Islam means submission. That is, you submit. Ultimately, it was either submit or die. That's kind of the way it was. You become a member of this, you embrace Islam, or we will kill you. And if we kill you, that pretty well guarantees us a place in the Islamic heaven, sort of a paradise, some heavens in sense to them, where their men in particular can have all the virgins they want and all the liquor they want. So this was their idea of heaven. And I will say that Islam is a very female unfriendly religion. They have no sympathy and very little concern or care for women except someone to be used. At 25, when he was 25 years old, Muhammad married a lady, a rich lady. She was quite older than him, 15 years. Her name was Khadijah, and she gave him 3 sons and 4 daughters. You remember in the Oriental tradition, that tradition of that day, it was really important that men have boys, because the boys were going to pick up and take on and keep the family heritage going and the lineage. The girls really didn't matter very much. It was the boys that mattered in that type of thinking. Certainly it was that way with Muhammad. Well, all 3 of these boys died. And then in 610, Muhammad had this religious experience that I mentioned a while ago, and he claimed that the prophet Gabriel had appeared to him and told him to begin this new religion, Islam, and that he was going to receive the Quran. In fact, in the Quran, he gives actually 4 accounts of this appearance of Gabriel to him to start this new religion, and it's rather ironic that every one contradict the other. Give you some idea of the inconsistency of Islam, and it makes you wonder how so many people around the world, and even now a growing number in America, to embrace this religion when it contradicts its own self in their chief book. But that is the way it is. For the next 20 years, Muhammad, who had this epilepsy, would fall on the ground and claim that he was getting revelation from God. In 619, his wife Khadijah, she died, and Muhammad married 12 other ladies over a period of time, and all of these women, of them, he had children, but only one son, and he died in infancy. So to the chagrin of Muhammad, he was not able to have children to carry on. However, he had done a tremendous job of convincing people of his religion, and he did it by force. It is a religion of force. Contrary to what you may have heard in the media and other spots, Islam is not a religion of peace. I'm not saying there are not people who are Mohammedans or who are Islamic, who are Muslims, who are not peaceful people. But as a religion, as a whole, in fact, if you get a copy of the Quran, and I have a copy of it, and I've read most of it, it's divided in what they call surahs, or chapters. It's kind of a different kind of arrangement. But if you read that thing, you will see pretty quick that it is a book that advocates violence, and it advocates killing your enemies. It advocates converting people who are pagans or heathens, that's what they call us, who are not Muslims, and you convert them, and if you can't convert them, it's okay to kill them, particularly in a holy war, a war like we're hearing about today. It's okay, and if you do that, you're going to be guaranteed a great position with Allah, who is their chief God. Now, you can see in your notes what the Islamic belief system is. As I said, it means submission. Muhammad developed the motto, Islam or the sword. You either become one of us or we put you to the sword. These 4 characteristics of Islam: it is monotheistic. It is somewhat like Judaism and Christianity. They say they believe in one God, and that God, of course, is Allah. I will tell you that Allah is not the same God of the Bible. They will tell you he is, but when you read their idea and their description of Allah, he is a very different God than the Jehovah God that we worship and his son, the Lord Jesus Christ. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is a major phrase, a major theme for Islam. Also, Islam believes in prophets. They will tell you quickly, they believe Jesus Christ was a prophet. In fact, they thought there were 28 prophets, starting with Abraham, but they say Jesus was a great prophet, Abraham is a great prophet, and Muhammad is a great prophet. These are the 3 greatest prophets of all, but Muhammad is the greatest. And they say in their religion that Muhammad is the person of the comforter. Jesus said, after I'm gone, a comforter will come. Muhammad said, I'm that comforter. He didn't say the comforter, he didn't believe in the Holy Spirit. He believed that he is that comforter and applied that to himself. Also, Islam believes in a final day of judgment. They who follow and obey Allah and Muhammad will go to paradise. Those who oppose Allah and Muhammad will be tortured in hell forever. Now, I might say, related to following Allah and Muhammad and going to heaven, that's not altogether as it might at first seem, because they also say that when you actually come to the end of your life, unless you kill a heretic, murder, or kill, as they wouldn't say murder, you kill a heathen, when you come down to the end of your life, you're going to be forced by Allah to cross a long bridge. And if you can successfully make it across that bridge, you make it into paradise. If you fall off the bridge, you're down. So it's sort of a iffy thing, but they would say, if you're one of Allah's elect, then you're going to make it across the bridge. If you're not, you're going to fall off. Also, Islam believes in salvation by works. It's not a matter of trusting Christ or even trusting Muhammad. It's a matter that you have to believe in Muhammad and Allah, but you have to do good works. And if you do enough good works and your good outweighs your bad, you've got a chance to make it across the bridge and, of course, into the Islamic heaven. Islam's holiest book is the Quran, which means the recitation, and that's that supposed revelation that Muhammad received from Gabriel over a period of time. And if you read the Quran, as I have, the Quran is a mixture. It's accumulation of Arabic theology from their pagan worship of the moon, and it's primarily centered around the moon. And Muhammad interjected in it various aspects of Judaism from the Old Testament, and also interjected into it various aspects of Christianity. So really Islam is sort of an amalgamation or a mixture of Judaism, Christianity, and the pagan religion. That's what it is. It spread. There's a reason why it spread, and let me explain that to you as best I can here in this next section. Muhammad's new religion was a mixture, as I've said, of these other religions. The rulers of Mecca, that's where he was born, near there, and that was sort of his hometown where he was known in that Arabic world. Well, those rulers of Mecca perceived the claim made by Muhammad that he should be a dictator, and he was ridiculed. They thought, you're trying to take us over. You're trying to become our boss, and we're not going to go for that. So they resisted him. The leaders early on in Mecca resisted him, and he was forced by them to flee from Mecca. And this is what is normally called the flight to Yathrib. It's where Medina is, called Al-Medina, and you hear of Mecca and Medina. Well, Mecca is where he was born, and Medina is where he fled, and both these places sort of became when he conquered his ground, his territory. When he got over there, he attacked Mecca. He had some men already. He had raised a military force up and trained them pretty well how to fight, and most of those camel riders, those Muslim, or those people, those Arabics back there, they already knew something about fighting. They were pretty much military oriented anyway. Well, Muhammad had seized on that and had forged them into a sort of military group, and when he got to Mecca, he conquered it, and there's where he established, or over in Yathrib, he got a group together in Medina, and he conquered them, the rest of them, and then he came back to his hometown of Mecca, and he just basically went in and conquered it. I mean, he went in and killed the people who refused to follow him and took it over and built a temple there. He built the Muslim temple there. And you know, a big thing with Muslims today in their lifetime is to make a trip to Mecca so they can go there and they can bow down and they can show their allegiance to Muhammad and what he taught. He was set on conquest. He set up his troops basically in Medina and got strong enough to go back and conquer Mecca, and then he had intent to move out and conquer everybody he could, and that's what he set out to do, and was having great success as his troops grew. And remember, it's conversion by the sword. You either become one of us or we will attack and we will kill you. If you will become one of us and join us and become part of our military, then you will share in the proceeds, in the spoils. When we conquer peoples, you can have some of the gold and you can have the power. So he had this growing military force, and they were set on conquest. But his conquest was abruptly interrupted by his death. So all of a sudden in 632, Muhammad, you got to pardon with me, I got a little frog right here, he's trying to get out. So what's going on? So anyway, the conquest effort was going, interrupted, but he had enough military men who had bought into his idea of ruling and of conquest, of forcing people into submission, that they continued his work, the conquest effort. And if you were looking at a map, and you are, and I'm not seeing the one in the back, fellas, I don't see it on just yet, but as you would look at this, you see where Yathrib is, and Medina is, and Mecca is, and look up to the sort of top to the north and over to the west toward Egypt, and this is all desert, this area, and I don't have my pointer here. I think I left it in my briefcase down there. But anyway, this area down here toward Yemen and this whole Saudi Arabian peninsula right here, it's a lot of desert, but he went around here, he and his forces, and after he died, his forces continued, and they took this area and crossed the Red Sea, went over here, but particularly went up to Egypt, and then they spread from Egypt to the west. Yeah, thank you. Preacher, I'll just take a break here. Yeah, this little pointer, there it is right there. I believe I see it. And beautiful. And so this is the area where he began to conquer all of that area on down around in here, over in here, but particularly over here. And even up in this area as well. And you know, that's around Israel, Jerusalem. He tried to make it up in there, and they went as far as they could. But especially here, they had great success. Early on, there had been churches from here all the way over to the Straits of Gibraltar, because you get to the Atlantic Ocean if you keep going in this direction. This is North Africa here. He went across North Africa, which was basically a Christian area, which I use that word loosely because there were lots of the drifter churches down in this area around Carthage and that part of North Africa. Well, he went in there and he conquered. And his men then after him conquered that area all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar over into Spain and conquered a great deal of Spain. And were moving into France. And this had gotten the attention of the Catholics, because you can see here now, and this didn't happen overnight, but over the next few hundred years it did, especially in the next 100 years, this group, this sudden explosion of this fellow from down here conquers all of North Africa and eradicates most of the Christians, kills them by the tens of thousands down here. And he's coming around, he's coming up, and he's crossed over into Europe. He's conquered Spain over here. He's coming into France. So he's on the west side of this Roman Empire, which is all up here. But he's also come up here, and he's made it all the way to Constantinople. And he's in charge pretty well. They've even, after a while, they conquered Jerusalem, and we'll talk about that. But here is on the east side, the south side, and the west side, this new political and military, very violent force. And so the Pope's sitting over here and his guys in Rome thinking, we got to do something about that. And so Charles Martel, who's a warrior with the Catholic Army, he met Muhammad's forces over here at a place and conquered them, and it sort of stemmed the tide. But that first 100 years was an era of conquest for Muhammad. And so I've sort of summarized with that this next session here, which talks about the rapid spread and the big threat. And I won't go through those point by point, but just know that's a summary of what was going on and why it upset the Catholics so bad, because they saw their domain under threat on three sides. And so we've got to do something about it. And through the monastic system, I mentioned monasteries, hermits, you know, these guys, monks, they formed orders like the Dominicans. You know about the friars and the Dominicans and the various Catholic orders. Many of these orders were military orders. That is, they were formed as military men to go to war. That's how there was so much war, or so many military efforts began to develop, and especially with the Crusades. And then after the Crusades, in the time of the Reformation, which we'll get to, Lord willing, tonight, the Catholics had a big army. They were a military force in part, and they could go out and they had what we would call the guns. I mean, they had the weapons of the day, and they were able to go out, and so they were able to fight here with Muhammad and at least Muhammad's followers and end the threat, at least stem the tide, I would say. They didn't end the threat. The threat's still with us today. You got to know that. They bombed the World Trade Center, done a whole lot of it. So the threat's still around, but they at least stemmed it so that the Bishop of Rome, and who was then by then the Pope, he realized we've sort of stemmed the bleeding here, stopped the bleeding. Now, let's talk for a moment. Let's go back to the Catholic regime and the state of the papacy at this time. You remember that Constantine wanted all of the people in the empire to be under his power. He wanted to be able to control them. So that was his idea of marrying the church to the state. And so over the next few centuries, this entity, which was started by Constantine, out of that drift of churches that was before him, became formalized into this state church, and it continued to grow and strengthen. And at the beginning of the 7th century, its power was so strong that we could successfully say around 600, 601, 602, along in there, that it had become the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, that's what they called themselves. That's where their strength was. They had a pope, they had all of those things. And for the next 600 years, it really grew. It just continued to strengthen and become richer. And I talked last night, at least some, about how it happened. How they made these alliances with their enemies who came, like the Germanic peoples who came, and they just got property, and they even taxed their own bishops and made them pay great sums of money at every turn. And so the papacy headquartered in Rome, Italy, became a tremendously powerful entity with lots of power to tell people what to do, to even govern kings and govern whole groups of people, particularly the lords of the caste system that existed at that time. But keep in mind, with the strengthening, with the power that came with the Pope and the strength of the Catholic Church, also came opposition. Not everybody's for it. There's a lot of opposition, and the stronger somebody gets, it seems, there's more people who are against that person who's stronger. So this is the way it was then, and I want to give you some of those people who weren't in favor of what the Roman Catholics were doing and who were opposing it in various and sundry ways. At first, not with very much success, but after about 600-700 years of it, they got enough, and they were able to turn the tide, and we'll get there later. There was first secular opposition. You can see that from the time of Constantine onward, virtually all secular powers resented and opposed the power of the state church. They said, this Bishop of Rome here has got too much authority. We don't like that. We don't want him to be able to dominate us. We want to be more independent of his jurisdiction and his power. The new Germanic peoples, these who came in, I mean, people like Childeric and Pepin the Short, and a lot of others that we could talk about here that overran the western part of the empire, were leery about too much power in the hands of this Bishop of Rome. This guy's getting too big. He's getting too big for his britches. Now, there are reasons why they didn't declare open war on the Pope, because he had his power of his own, but there was this uneasy feeling, and a growing feeling, I might say, of uneasiness in the power that was invested in the Pope. Also, there was religious opposition. Besides the political leaders didn't like it and were fearful of it, there were also religious people who didn't like it. Remember, from Constantine onward, and even before Constantine, there were those who did not support the drift away from New Testament Christianity. They stayed with what the Bible said, and they said, this is wrong. This man embodies, and this entity, this papacy and growing state church embodies that which is evil. They've left the Bible, they've left salvation by grace through faith, and they're teaching falsehood, and so there are these dissenters, these people who are not a part and never were a part of the state church. And we've talked about the Montanists and the Novatians and the Donatists, and they were probably the biggest and the strongest of the group, especially from about 250 to 300 onward, really until probably 1000 AD. For the next 500 or 600 years, the Donatists were a strong group that was in the central part of Europe, particularly in Italy and upward. They were a major force who were against the Pope and said, we don't believe this is right, and they, of course, kept opposing that. But then there were others, as I mentioned, like the Welsh Baptists and the Paulicians, the Bogomils, the Waldenses, the Albigenses, and the names are many of these who stayed true to the Word of God. And every one of those people, boy, they just didn't like what was going on in Rome. And then there were struggles within the state church for dominancy and supremacy. You remember that the Bishop of Rome kept being on the right side in these debates, these theological debates about the deity of Christ and all of that stuff. And he kept getting more power because he's close to the Constantine, who still has his headquarters over there in Rome at the time, didn't move them till later. So these people within the whole Christendom area, they didn't like it that somehow this church in Rome became the primary church. It got bigger and stronger because in Jerusalem, they were saying, hey, there's a church here too, and this is where it really started. Jesus Christ started it here. We ought to be the prime church. And down at Alexandria, Egypt, you saw on the slide a while ago, they have a seminary down there, and it's getting big, and there are a lot of people down there, very powerful, and they say, we're the bigger church, we're the stronger church, the center ought to be here. We ought to be the head church. And Antioch, the one that sent out Paul over in Syria, well, they're saying church ought to be here. And when Constantine moved the capital over to Constantinople, and they set up that Eastern Orthodox Church, you know, the eastern end of that, and the Byzantine Empire with its patriarchs began to flourish, well, they were saying, we ought to be the number one church. So this war, internal war among Christianity, is waging at the time, and not everybody's on board with the Pope down in Rome. The bishops of Rome and the bishops of Constantinople were constantly at each other. And I say bishops of Constantinople, they called them patriarchs over there. The head man was the patriarch, where the head man in the western end over in Rome was called the Pope after a while. Well, they were constantly, both of these sides were jockeying for power. First, it was the empire headquartered at Rome. Then Constantine saw those Germanic peoples come in and realized, I got to get out of harm's way. He moved the capital over to Constantinople, and there's where he then begins to thrive. And then followers of him are the old Roman emperors, and they're over there. So here's a headquarters here, but meanwhile over here is the Bishop of Rome, and he's making peace with these German people who are coming in here and getting more powerful. So you see, you have these two major headquarters of power, and the patriarchs over here and the popes over here, and they're at odds with each other. They're warring with each other. So these are the kind of struggles that are going on inside. But corruption became a major reason why there was opposition to what was going on in Rome. And this one grew. I mean, it really grew and became a breaking point, partly financially. Can't you imagine what they thought? I mean, what the people in the empire under the Bishop of Rome thought when this entity, this headquarters, this Pope and those in his household and in the head of the church, as they were saying, began to build these big buildings and accumulate all this lavish wealth, and began to tax these feudal lords. I mean, these guys who had estates and all set up, and boy, he's just draining them for every cent he can get out of every lord and all of his knights. And on top of that, these bishops under there, they're having to pay a year's salary to get into their position, and then they're moved, and they got to pay it again, and they got to bid and pay money to keep their seat here. And I mean, this corruption is just growing, and the financial exploitation is causing tempers to rise and people to resent what's going on in Rome. But yet Rome is bigger and Rome is stronger. And remember, the Pope has the power, in his opinion, and he's convinced these people, I have the power to excommunicate you to hell. If you don't go along with me and pay your taxes, you rise up against me, I'll not only send you to hell, I'll get all the other neighbors around together, and we'll come in there and we'll crush you, buddy. Well, these guys stayed in tow for a long time, but they didn't stay in tow happily about it. At least most of them didn't stay in tow happily about it. They resented what was going on here and this financial exploitation. But a second area that they hated, and that was the immorality, the absolute corruption of morals that was being openly practiced in the Catholic Church. Not only among the bishops, these legates, these hunters of people who were not Catholics, who were persecuting them and killing many of them in macabre, awful ways. But what was happening, especially in the center, I mean down there in Rome, boy, I'll tell you, there was so much. As you can see here in my notes, these legates, inquisitors, bishops, monks, and other church officials were supposed to be holy men of God and sworn to celibacy, but they were sexually promiscuous. I mean, they were just raw. I mean, just absolute immoral. It was common for church officials to use their elevated positions to force sex with females of their choosing. Homosexuality was absolutely rampant. It was just rampant in the whole system, and you got to see that in our lifetime. It hadn't been long ago. I mean, the Catholic Church this very day is having trouble over the issue of homosexuality, and especially pedophiles who are messing with kids, these homosexual priests that get these little boys in here and do these bad things to them. I mean, so this has been going on a long, long time. And Europe, even without newspapers and television and things, they saw it. I mean, and they just hated it. And can you imagine the women who live there? Who here's the bishop, and he's the big guy. I mean, he's got the backing of the lords, and he comes along and he just goes into this house or that house and he forces sex with any woman that he wants. I mean, it's just the way it worked. And they went into these monasteries where these nuns are supposed to be pure, and they had sex with nuns and had little babies in there. And actually have been found that in the walls of monasteries, just piles of baby bones in there where they buried these kids. I mean, it's just an awful thing. It's not hard to see how the immorality of this picture just became sickening to the people as a whole, and there was this great resentment. So the result of that, as you can see in the note, was poor papal prestige. Even though they were strong, they were bully strong. They were strong because they could send people to hell. They had the military might under the power of the Pope, and he could boss them around and tell them who to fight and who to put down. Still, it's a ball and cauldron. I mean, it's a situation that is getting ripe for a break, and the attitude toward the whole system is deteriorating, so that there's a dislike toward the whole Catholic system, but the people don't hardly know what to do about it. They don't have the power, they don't know how to rise up and throw off the oppression that they're all feeling. And suddenly, a new development occurred that the Pope saw as an opportunity to gain popularity and get back in power again, and that is the Crusades. What happened was that during the latter part of the 11th century, Europe was a truly ripe field for exploitation. And the popes capitalized on the situation in royal fashion. There were many reasons why Catholic Europe was so willing to unify against the Muslims. And remember, the Muslims have come on the scene. They're conquerors. They have conquered broad areas that used to be Catholic areas. They've taken over North Africa particularly. And they threaten Constantinople on the east end. It's like we're going to take them, and the threat just seems to grow, and the Muslim movement seems to grow stronger and stronger. And as a result, the popes came upon the idea, we're going to go and conquer these Muslims because they have taken our beloved city of Jerusalem. You see the picture of Jerusalem. You see that gold dome right here in the middle. If you could go over there and visit this shot right here. Let's see, did I do that, or all of a sudden there it went, vanished away. If we can go back to that slide here, yes. This is the Cauldron Valley right here. This is standing near the Jewish big cemetery on the Mount of Olives. When I shot this picture, I'm on the Mount of Olives, and I just shot the picture right across. This is the old city wall of Jerusalem. Here's the pinnacle of the temple, as it was called, because this Temple Mount is right over in here. And this is the Mosque of Omar with the gold. That's gold. That's not fake. That's real gold dome. This is built right here where the temple used to stand. So the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, took it. And they wouldn't let people from Europe who had the means to do it go there and visit. They killed some of them, They let them in at all. They taxed them. They did bad things to them. So there is a latent hatred for Islam among Europe. Especially it came to a head over this city and over the Muslims conquering the city of Jerusalem. So let me give you some of the good reasons why the Crusades became popular and why people were ready to get in there and do it and go there to this place far away and war as they did. First of all, the glamour and the romance was there. A pilgrimage to Jerusalem. I've talked to some of you, and several of you have said, boy, I'd like to go to Jerusalem. It's been my privilege to go there 14 times and take groups, and I still love to go to Jerusalem. It's a wonderful place. It just makes your Bible come alive. I encourage you to go. Well, back then, I'm talking about way back here in the time of these Crusades, people wanted to go to Jerusalem. They wanted it. It was a glamorous place. They had heard about it, read about it, and all of that stuff. So they viewed the Holy Land as a place where they could find God. They might even go over there and find a relic of some sort, maybe a Roman coin, or maybe, as they would say, a piece of the cross, something like that, take it back home with them. So it was just a very glamorous prospect for our people when they thought about the possibility of going on a crusade to fight the Muslims in Jerusalem, Israel. Man, let me on board. I'm signing up today. There was also the revenge factor, because these Muslims had been fighting them and had conquered all around, taken Christian, as they called it, areas, and had subdued the people, killed a lot of the folks, and these people in Europe were ready to take revenge. We'll get even with those guys. We'll polish them off. Also, opportunity for freedom. Remember, Europe was in a caste system where if you were born a peasant, you were always a peasant. Where there was oppression from the lords down to especially the peasant. And where strongest ruled, the guy that was the chief lord of this fiefdom, if he was stronger than the next fiefdom, he would conquer the next fiefdom or take property for the next. So there was this oppression. If you grew up there in that kind of system, it was an oppressive system, and if you could get out of that system and go to Jerusalem, you just might find an opportunity to do better. Somehow it was at least a relief, a get away from where you had spent your life and where your parents had spent their life. So they saw a trip to the Holy Land as opportunity. Some of them saw I could start a business of my own. If I could get away from my Lord here, I'd never get under him again. I'd hide from him. He couldn't find me. And I'd start a business of silk trade or paper trade or spices or some other thing, because those things were available in the East, where they weren't so much in the West. Between 1188 and 1270, the kings of France joined with the Pope in gathering crusaders, and they granted them exemption from debt and freedom from taxation and the payment of interest, so that the Crusades didn't just appeal to the poor peasants. It appealed to the people of higher esteem, people who were lords and leudes and all of those that were in there, because most of them had debts. And some of the debts were that when the men from the Pope came to collect taxes, which they did every year from all of these lords of these fiefs or these caste places, they didn't have the money to pay it. So they were in debt to the Pope. And they hated it. Anybody hates debt. I think all of us hate debt, and debt collectors. And so the Pope would impose fines, kind of like the IRS, and you just know how you feel about that kind of stuff. Well, they could be freed if they'd lead their people, get together a bunch of their folks and go to Jerusalem on a crusade. Well, they could be freed from not only the debts they owed, but from future taxes. So it was a very appealing thing to those as well. And then there was the idea of adventure and the license to sin. This was probably the major reason that people went there. Some of Europe's most eminent men went to the Crusades, but so did also, quote, the lowest elements of European society: thieves, murderers, perjurers, vagabonds, and scoundrels of all sort. That's what they did. So they went. And they received indulgences. And remember, I talked about indulgences being a blank check to sin. If you pay the church through its leadership a certain amount of money, build a castle or do something of that sort, you've got sins paid up ahead of time. Well, the Pope said you can put some money in escrow here by going on a crusade. You don't have to have money. If you go on a crusade, we're going to go ahead and say it's okay to sin. So you can kill people over there. In fact, it would be a real trophy if you killed a Muslim. That's what they told people. Murder them, I mean, kill them. They're just nobodies. They're just no good. So it's okay to kill. It's okay to rape. It's okay to sin. Rob, take from the people along the trail as you go, steal their cows, steal whatever. You can just do whatever you want to do. And he even went so far as to say, if you go on a crusade, you're guaranteed heaven. I mean, you're just going to get in for sure. No doubt about it. And even after a while said, if you go on a crusade, you not only make it to heaven, but you also might get your mom and dad into heaven. We'll get the whole family in because you went on a crusade. Well, that's the way it went. So it was appealing. Well, the crusades were primarily against the Muslims. Now, I'm going to just really zip right here through these different crusades. There were, as you can see, several of them. The information is in your notes. 1095 to 1099, a 4-year crusade, the first one. It's a crusader group to Jerusalem. There were 67,000 men, women, and children that marched to Jerusalem on this one. All but 7,000 of them perished in the crusade. After this, 50,000 European soldiers marched on to Nicaea and defeated the Turkish army. In this crusade, the crusaders actually took back Jerusalem. That's one of the things they want to do. So this one ended. Even though it was a fiasco within itself, it still managed to bring back Jerusalem. And then there was a second crusade, 1147 to 1149. And it started when the Turks massacred the whole city of Edessa. And boy, that really did torque the Pope, and it torqued a lot of these leaders of Europe. And so Pope Eugenius III commissioned Bernard of Clairvaux. He was a monk to preach the crusade. He got 70,000 soldiers from France and Germany to take back Edessa. Two groups, though, the Germans and the French couldn't get along, and they couldn't work together, so the whole effort failed, and the Muslims took back Jerusalem at this point. And then the third crusade is probably the most famous of all the crusades. You've seen it glamorized in some of our movies. Richard the Lionhearted called for this crusade. You know, he was an English guy. It's called the Crusade of the Kings. He failed to retake Jerusalem, but he did make peace with Saladin, or Salihadin, some as he's sometimes pronounced, the Egyptian, and they negotiated, and Saladin allowed crusaders, or not crusaders, but pilgrims to go back to Jerusalem, but with a tax. They could at least go, but they had to pay this big tax to do it. And then there was a fourth crusade. Pope Innocent III decided to revive the Crusader spirit in 1200 because the Eastern Catholics were kind of making friends with the Turks. So this became another fiasco. I just encourage you, if you get the book, to read that particular chapter. It'd just be amazing to you to read about the Fourth Crusade. And I think the saddest of all the crusade was the Children's Crusade in 1212. 12-year-old French boy named Stephen claimed that he had a vision from Christ that he should rescue the holy places. This 12-year-old boy, this 12-year-old French boy. And so children, Catholic children from all over the continent of Europe joined him and took off, walked all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, got on some ships, thought they were going to Israel and to Jerusalem to retake Jerusalem, and they fell into slave traders, and one group of them went off apparently to North Africa, and they just lost. They got lost. Nobody knows for sure what happened to these kids. And then another group of the kids embarked from another place, and they also fell into bad times and didn't do a thing. I mean, it just killed 30,000 or so kids in the process of the thing. Now, the results of the Crusades are, I think, important to just take a little look at. And new learning was introduced from the East. That's one thing. People over in the East, they had the Greek manuscripts. They knew the languages, and they had a much superior system of education. The Crusaders were exposed to this advanced knowledge, and some of the copies of the Scriptures were actually were taken and brought back to Rome. And it was an eye-opening thing. See, Rome didn't have many of the Scriptures, so the popes could say whatever they wanted to say, but when people got the actual Scriptures and began to look at them, it began to shake the foundations. They said, well, you've been telling us this, and here's what the Scriptures say. So it began to shake the foundations. It proved an eye-opening experience. Also, feudalism was weakened, and I think you can see why feudalism was weakened. These people, many of the peasants, went on these crusades, and they were taken away from their lords. And the lords didn't have the power, the manpower to keep their farms going, all that work going. It was going and being done by these peasants out here. Furthermore, many of the lords themselves and the knights entered these crusades. A lot of them went out there and they got killed by these Arabic people. And some of them just died of exposure along the way. So they never came home. And all of a sudden, the whole system of feudalism with its big bosses began to weaken because the Crusades were taking the people away. And in the same time, nationalism was fostered. Remember early on, I'm talking about here in the 10th century and the 11th century and along in there, it's just mainly feudal kingdoms. But somehow as time went along, and particularly because of the Crusades, French people began to think of themselves as Frenchmen, and English people began to think of themselves as Englishmen, and Italians as Italians, and Germans as Germans. So this sense of nationalism began to emerge on the scene, and they wanted the lords that were left felt like they needed a central power, a political power with a military force that could sort of help them with protection and to get French interest advanced and German interest advanced. So with this going on, it's like the rise of nations. And it didn't take too long to what is now France and now Spain and now Germany, and all the boundaries kind of got set, and they're pretty much the way they are today. But this is the time that these nations actually begin to emerge. And cities and commerce began to spring up. They got to the east, they saw this silk trade and these spices trade and other kinds of trades, and they came back and they became traders. They didn't go back to these lords and start doing that stuff again. They set up businesses and cities. London sprang up, and Paris sprang up, and Prague sprang up, and all these different cities sprang up. And so the whole system was changing, and there's a middle class emerging, and that hadn't been before. Remember, there was no middle class in the caste system. So what happened was the Pope lost his grip really on Europe. Now, the Catholics weren't going to sit down and take this going easy. And I'm not going to cover this section, particularly on the Crusades against Christians. But what I do want to say, to summarize it, is this. It's easy to think, in view of Hollywood, that all of the Crusades were against the Muslims, those bad guys down there who took Jerusalem and who ruined our city. A whole lot of the Crusades were also against the Christians who were not Catholics, those who were the dissenters, those Waldenses and those Albigenses. Boy, those popes said these are evil too. And we've got the military now. Let's go deal with the Waldenses. Let's go deal with the Bosnians, these Bogomils up there. And so these popes sent out these military groups, and they took over people. They killed them. They massacred whole groups of them. I mean, whole cities, like Val-Louise, and it's in here in your notes. I mean, they just went in and they just killed them all, 3,000 of them in this one little town here. Mercilessly. Beat their babies to death. I mean, it just did horrible, agonizing things to these people. And this is the very grounds from which the conquistadors, the conquerors, came. We sort of glamorize people like Ponce de Leon and these other conquerors, Veracruz, and these people who came and conquered. You got to know, they were out for money. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, not so he could find a new place. He was looking for money, and he found some money. And some of these others, Cortez, they found the money. Montezuma was killed, and they were taken over. The very impetus for the conquistadors was first money, but it was also for domination and control. There was religious back. We go, and remember, we're a secularist group, so whatever we conquer, the people there become our religion. So when we go and conquer Mexico, the Mexicans become Catholics. If we go and conquer somewhere else, they become Catholics. And so that happened, and that's why you see so much of Latin America is a Catholic part, and why North America was not so much so. It is more, but it wasn't to start. This brought about Reformation, and I want to talk about these reformers for just a moment. There are three primary groups of reform that wanted to do something about the bad stuff that was going on in this big entity, the Catholic Church. There were the classical reformers, and I'll summarize to say the classical reformers simply wanted to take the church back to what it was when Constantine first married it to the state. They said, corruption has come in, financial exploitation has come in, the church has become really bad. What we need to do, we need to reform it, go back to where it was when Constantine married the church and the state, and let's go from there. They weren't against the doctrine. They weren't against infant baptism and none of that stuff. They just didn't like the corruption that was going on. These are what are called classical reformers. But then there were also what are called the radical reformers. The radical reformers said, no, the Catholic Church is corrupt. It never was the true church, and we need to get rid of the thing. I mean, we need to get here to real New Testament Christianity and do it the way these Waldenses are doing it, and some of these others are doing it. We need to do away with that bad system. And John Huss in Bohemia was one of those guys who preached that, and he got a good hearing because a lot of folks, the Bohemian kings, were behind him, or leaders were behind him. And so the Pope wanted to have a meeting with him, and so Sigismund, I think was his name, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, he said, well, if you'll meet with us, we'll give you safe passage to the meeting and back home. Well, he went to the meeting, and when he got to the meeting, the Catholic authorities said, we don't keep our word to heretics, and they burned him at the stake. That's what happened. So just crushing anybody that's a reformer. Among those also was John Wycliffe. I hope you know something about him, but he's a man who was used of God especially to get the Bible started, to get it into the English language. I mean, God really used this man, but it cost him a great deal. And I won't have time to talk about him, but I want to tell you that the third group were the counter-reformers, and the counter-reformers merely wanted to clean up the inside of the Catholic Church. They didn't want to destroy it. These were against starting a new church of any sort outside the Catholic Church. They just wanted to sort of clean up the bad stuff inside. And we're just totally out of time. Brother Ed,